Hey everybody, today I'm taking a look at The Gardens, which is a 1 to 4 player board game designed by Brett Gilbert and Matthew Dunstan. This one takes around 30 to 45 minutes to play on average. But before I get into my review on The Gardens, I just want to give a shout out to the show's sponsor, Keyender.co.uk, who are my go-to online retailer in the UK, and if you use my link in the show notes, you can get 5% off your first order. But let's get into the review on The Gardens. Okay, so the setup for The Gardens is going to look somewhat like this, where you have these 3 different rows of cards to draft from. You've got 3 different decks here. You've got the A deck, the B deck, and the C deck, and the number of cards from each deck that are on display is going to depend or vary on the player count. So in a 3 or 4 player game, you're going to have 3 or 4 cards respectively. But in a 2 player game, you're also going to have 4 cards because you actually draft twice the number of cards. So in a 3 or 4 player game, you're going to play over 8 rounds. And in a 2 player game, you're going to play over 4 rounds. You've also got the main board here, which is essentially a score track. And you've got these variable objectives, which are the criteria that you're trying to aim for to gather points throughout the game. And also each player is going to have their own individual player board that look like this. And these are modular, so you can actually change them around if you want to, but I would recommend just playing the basic way here, where you've got these 2 boards next to each other and you've got this default strip down the middle. And on this strip, you have 3 meeples, 1 for each of those rows. So each player's turn is going to be rather simple, where the starting player, the one with this kind of bird token here, is going to have first choice to draft any of these cards from either of these rows. So let's just say, for example, here the first player wanted to choose these double trees here like this. And because it's come from the B row, it has to go in the middle row of your personal player board. And also when you place these cards, you have to build from the middle outwards. So at the moment I can only place it here or here. But as I build more cards, I can start spreading out like so. So let's just say I ended up placing this card like this, and then I'm going to move the meeple from that row onto the card that I've just placed, like so. And that is going to be kind of one of the unique mechanisms about the game. And all of the different features on these cards, you've got these trees, you've got these lakes, you've got fountains, you've got these benches, and you've also got these statues and roads. All of those different features are going to score in a different way. So you've got these 4 features that score at the end of the game, and you've got 3 features that score during the game. So you can see here that the trees, the ones I've just placed, are going to score points based on how many I pass through. So let's have a look here. So I placed this this tree like so. I'm going to move it from that one to this one, and that means I've now touched 2 trees, and that also counts from the one you started from. You are going to have a look on this little tile here and see how many trees I passed through, i.e. 2, and that's going to give me 3 points. So I'll be about 3 on the score track. And I believe there's 4 different types of these featured trees, and you're only going to score for the one on the card that you've just placed. And once the first player has finished placing the card, moving their meeple and maybe getting points, it's going to go to the next player to draft. However, when they draft, they do not need to choose from the same row that you've just chosen from. They can actually pick any from the display. So let's just say the next player chose this one here and put it on their board. And then the third player wanted to choose this one here like so. And then it'll get back to the original player. However, now the original player has already placed a card in the middle row or the B row, then they are not allowed to choose another card from that row. They're going to have to choose another one. So each round, you're going to place 1 card on each of the 3 rows. So let's just say, for example, they wanted to choose this one here. And again, because it's on the A row, you're going to have to put it on the A row here like so. And again, move the meeple from the spot that it's already on onto the card that you've just placed. I've touched 1 tree, therefore that's going to get me another point. So at the end of the game, your player board is going to look something like this, where every single spot has a card placed on it. And then you're going to add all the points you've got during the game to the end game scoring criteria. But let's have a look at how all the different criteria score. So we've already covered the trees and how they work by placing a card, and then whatever you land on or pass through, you're going to get a corresponding amount of points depending on the amount of trees of that type that you've passed through. The fountains here work in a very similar way, but you get a point for every lake or fountain that you cross through. You've also got the park benches here, which will score you a point for every surrounding card that you have on your player board. So when you place these cards, you want to be making sure that you've already built a bit of an infrastructure around it to get the most points out of that placement. You've got these end game scoring ones here where you're going to score a number of points depending on the amount of different trees you have on each row. So if you have all 4 different tree types or the featured tree types, then you get 10 points. But if you only have, say, 2, you're going to get 3 points. You've got these lake scoring ones here, which will score you 5 points if you have a whole column of matching lake like this. But if you only ever have 2 out of the 3, then you're going to score 2 points rather than the 5. You've got this one here, which is going to score you a point for each connecting road you have in your longest kind of sequence. So I think I've done quite well here by having, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, I believe. So that's quite a good achievement there. And you've got this statue one here, because you can see some of these cards have statues on, where you're going to score 10 points for every other player that you have more statues than. So that adds a little bit of player interaction into the mix. And there are a bunch of other scoring tiles that you can choose to use. These are slightly more advanced than the base ones, but not terribly more so. You got ones here where the statues want to be or not adjacent to the statues, so you want to have them isolated on their own. Each column of fountains that you have, you're going to get more points. You got ones here where you want to have you score points for your biggest cluster of focal trees, regardless if it's rows or columns. You've got ones like this where you want to have the pathways connecting to park benches and so on, and you get the gist. So there's quite a lot of modularity there if you want to kind of tweak the rules slightly. There is a further advanced variant that you can choose to play with where you have these illustrations already on your player boards, and then during the setup of the game, you're going to put these cards on the matching spots, and that is going to add some more interaction to the game where if you are the first player to place your card on that spot, then you are either going to get victory points depending on the orientation that card is flipped, or you can get an end game or in-game bonus. So they'll do things such as this one here where you can either get 10 points if it's facing that way, or at the end of the game choose one type of focal tree and score 2 points for every tree of this type in your garden. Or you've got like the opera house here, which will give you 10 points, or at the end of the game score 10 points for every complete loop in your pathways. So again, just little tweaks on the rules here just to add a little bit more depth. Okay, so let's get into my thoughts on the gardens. So you could probably tell there from the little playthrough that this is certainly tailored towards a lighter, more introductory level gamer, which of course is absolutely fine. But the thing that drew me into this game, the thing that sold it to me and made me back it on Kickstarter, was this Meeple movement system. I've never seen this used before. I think it's a very novel mechanism, and I certainly feel like it's got a lot of potential. This idea of placing a card down and then moving or physically moving a meeple from one row to another spot on that row, and depending on what you pass through is going to get you points. So that kind of adds a bit of legacy to the game where previous decisions are going to affect future decisions. And that, again, that is the thing that really did sell me on this one. Now, I will admit that I think that this mechanism has a ton of potential, but I do feel like this game has almost hamstrung itself by being so light, because all these features score in pretty much the same way. They're not terribly interesting in the way they work. You're going to score points based on how many trees you pass through or how many, lakes or fountains you pass through. It's like there's not much variation in what they do and how they score and how that mechanism is actually exploited to make it feel different. Now, that being said, I do think that the idea of building your Tableau out adds a bit more weight to the way that Meeple movement system works, because because you have to start from the middle and build outwards as you go. You can sometimes end up building cards right next to each other, which means that if last round my Meeple was here and then I place this card, I'm only going to move one spot, which is going to somewhat limit my potential to score points on that round. However, if I end up building like a cluster of the same features here, and then I end up kind of going back and forth, going back here, and then back here, and then back here, and then back here, then you're probably going to end up scoring more and more of those multipliers by placing, the same feature down. So there is a good balancing between the two and how you are going to keep dragging that Meeple back and forth throughout the rows. That adds a little bit more depth to the game, which I did appreciate. Now, I must admit that I did find the drafting system a bit too restrictive, especially at the 3 or 4 player count where you're essentially just drafting one card per row, and quite often there is nothing you're interested in that row. There might just be a bunch of lakes and you've not really focused on lakes, and you're not going to end up scoring many points for them at all, and there's nothing really much you can do about that. Now, I do understand why they have kept the pool so tight, because it adds more kind of consequence and more tension to each of the drafts, because you need to prioritize things accordingly. If you really wanted this road here because it's going to connect a bunch of your roads, then you're going to do that and you're going to fall behind on the other ones. But that being said, I do feel like they would have been better if there was a few more options there to actually get more potential of scoring from the tiles, because a lot of the time I felt like I would just had a choice there that no matter what I choose is going to be crap. So that was a bit frustrating at times for me personally. I do think there's a good mix of in-game and end-game points, and it's nice that you do have some variation there just to tweak the gameplay and to change the end-game and in-game objectives and how all the different features score. So again, just adds a little bit of life into the game, and it's kind of a good balance between the two. Do you really want to focus on getting all the same trees in the same rows to exploit this Meeple system, or are you going to take a more balanced strategy and get all the different types in the row? And they're of course going to conflict with each other because you've only got so much space in your actual board. And of course you are restricted by the card drafts in the first place. So you're always having to adjust on the fly to see how you're going to get the most points from each of these different tiles. Now, that being said, I do feel like these tiles are not terribly interesting or creative. I mean, if you're familiar with these style of games, then you're probably aware that there's a lot of games of this type out there, i.e. just placing things on your board and scoring points based on public objectives or public tiles. And this one doesn't really do anything new. And even at times, it feels like the turns are not terribly eventful. You place a card down, you might get a point for a tree. It's like, big whoop. It doesn't feel like you're achieving much at times. If you're crossing through 4 trees at a time, sometimes it feels a bit more rewarding when you're getting a big chunk of 10 points, but generally it's a bit bitty. You're getting a few points here, a few points there. You can get some more, bigger chunks of points at the end of the game if you end up building a big network of roads or something. But I must admit, it did feel a bit incremental, and it doesn't feel like you pull off those big, incredible, satisfying turns. And that also applies to the extra tiles. These are, I think they're written in the book as advanced tiles, and I will say that they don't really feel advanced. They are very slightly more complex than the base game ones, or the recommended starting setup. So again, they all still feel a bit predictable and it feels like they've been done 100 times before. There are a few ones that are a bit more interesting. I quite like this one here, where you have to have a balanced kind of number of feature trees on each side of your centerpiece. So that adds a bit more long-term strategy and adds a bit more tension to keep the things balanced. But generally speaking, they're all just, again, minor tweaks on the original ones. I think one thing that works in this game's advantage is how quick it takes to play. You are looking at 30 minutes on average, maybe slightly more than that at the full player count, but not much more. And all the turns are snappy, they're quick, the rules are digestible, you can get it explained in a few minutes, and everyone's going to pretty much know what to do. So it doesn't outstay its welcome, and it feels like quite a breezy, quick experience. The player interaction mainly does come through the competition for the cards that you want and how you're going to prioritise your draft. However, I did mention that the statue feature does add some just interaction into the game because you want to be having more statues than your opponent. So it is nice they made that a little bit of effort to add a bit more competition to the game. But generally speaking, you're going to be focusing on your own board and just reacting to what's available to you. I don't feel this has that level of hate drafting or anything like that. You're just going to be working on your own puzzle. And if that affects other people, then so be it. It's not really something you're going to be directly looking to do. The game does scale pretty well, and I have to say I think the game works best at 1 or 2 players. Now, the reason I say that is because at 2 players, you actually have 2 cards per row per round, which means you have some contingency plans if people draft cards that you wanted before you get the chance to. So again, you have a bit more of a bigger picture in your mind and can tailor your strategy more towards the public objectives. And that also applies to the solo mode where, say you have a lake in each of the rows, you can maybe look at doing that for your turn, building a whole column of lakes and scoring the corresponding amount of points, where in the 3 or 4 player rounds, if people snatch that card, you're pretty much just left at their mercy and have to deal with what's left. I think the game is wonderfully produced, particularly when it comes to the visual design. It has a unique look, and I can't really think of any other game that uses this look. This kind of like old school brochure, advertising poster visuals that really works for the game, and I must admit it was actually one of these selling points to me. Yeah, especially when everything is said and done and your board is finished, it has a very nice look to it. Now the cardstock is of a good quality. These are linen finished cards, and they are of a good size. It's good that they're not too big because it doesn't take up too much room, but smaller might have been a little bit fiddly, so I think they've chosen the exact right card size here. The main board itself is dual layer, where you can slot in these scoring tiles, and they're not going to move anywhere, which is quite nice. But everything else is just well finished, nicely polished, and I've certainly got no quibbles at all with the way the game has been produced and made. Okay, so let's get into some final thoughts on the gardens. So I must admit that I was left a little bit wanting from this game. For me, it felt like it was a bit too simple, and that's not because the game is too light. I'm certainly not against light games at all. In fact, I like a lot of light games. But I do feel like this one has a glass ceiling on what it does and how it works. I was completely enamored with the way the game looks and really intrigued about this Meeple movement system. I would have loved to have seen this exploited to a higher standard, and I still think there's a lot of potential here to how this could be used. But in reality, this is just very simple stuff. Now, I also feel like this puzzly style game mixed with the variable objectives has been done better through other designs that are very slightly more complex or more advanced than this one. I'm talking games such as Cartographers or the Isle of Skye. I just think those games are just more enjoyable. They have a more of a visceral tension to them, and there's just something about them that just I extract more enjoyment from. Now, I do appreciate that this is tailored towards a more introductory level gamer. But even that being said, I do feel like if you're teaching this to someone who's not played many games at all, then even then they are going to move on quickly from it, because there's only so much you can get from this, in my opinion. And that even applies to the additional kind of modules and stuff you can add in to add a bit more complexity to it. It just feels like it's been done before, and although there's nothing glaringly wrong with it, I just feel like it's a bit flatline for me. And it feels like I've played this game before 10 times. So unfortunately, despite how gorgeous it is, I'd love to see this artwork used again because it looks wonderful. I just feel like there's not much here for you to spend too much time on, and I don't think it's ultimately worth your time or attention when you could be playing some of these other games I mentioned. So sadly, not a recommendation from me. That is The Gardens.